I knew the family I'd built over 43 years had been quietly dismantled the moment I sat alone in the corridor outside the cardiac care unit at Royal Brisbane Hospital, watching my wife through a glass panel that may as well have been a wall between two different worlds. My phone went off in my coat pocket. Not a call from the cardiologist. Not a message from the ward sister. A social media notification from the wife of my eldest son. There she was on the screen. My daughter-in-law, raising a flute of champagne on a yacht moored off the Whitsundays. My eldest son grinning beside her with one arm around her waist. And just behind them, my youngest daughter laughing at something off camera while she held up a plate of oysters as if she were posing for a magazine spread. The caption read, "Family time." Finally, while I was counting the seconds between each beep of my wife's heart monitor, my children had decided this was a celebration weekend. Before I go any further with this, if you've stayed with me this far, please do me a kindness and subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. Stay with me a little longer, because what happened over the next 11 days changed everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the people I once trusted with my life. I switched the phone off and held it face down on my knee for what felt like a very long time. The hallway outside the cardiac care unit was lit by those long fluorescent tubes that flatten every shadow and make the skin under your eyes look gray. A cleaning trolley rolled past. A nurse nodded at me without really seeing me. I nodded back out of pure habit. In a place like that, everyone you meet is carrying the same weight. And after a while, you stop pretending otherwise. It had only been 5 hours. 5 hours since my wife, Rosalind, had stood in the kitchen of our home in Toowong, complaining good-naturedly that I'd left the back door open and let one of the neighbors' possums in again. She was making us a cup of tea. Then she stopped mid-sentence, put one hand against the bench, and went down. There was no warning, no clutched chest, no gasp, just a slow folding, like a curtain coming down. I called 000 with a voice so steady that even now I can't quite explain it. The paramedics were there in 11 minutes. By the time we reached the hospital, the registrar had already told me the words I'd been afraid of all the way in the back of the ambulance. Massive coronary event. Possible secondary stroke. Critical. Unstable. The next 48 hours will tell us. I'd spent 36 years working as a structural engineer, mostly in mining infrastructure across Queensland and the Northern Territory. I'd handled bridge collapses, partial roof failures, 2 evacuations, and a fire that took out a switch room the size of a tennis court. I thought I understood pressure, but none of that prepared me for the silence of standing in a hospital corridor, holding a phone, knowing I had 3 children I'd raised on my own shoulders, and not one of them had picked up. I'd called my eldest son, Alistair, first. 41 years old, a senior associate at a corporate law firm in Sydney. He'd answered on the 4th ring, sounding faintly annoyed, the way he always did when work was busy. He listened to about 20 seconds of what I said, then told me he was already at Hamilton Island for a long-planned holiday and he simply couldn't get back tonight. He said he was sure Mum was in good hands and that he'd ring the hospital himself in the morning. Then he said, almost as an afterthought, that I should hold off making any decisions until he was back. He didn't ask which hospital. He didn't ask which doctor. He didn't ask whether she was conscious. I rang my middle child, my daughter, Imogen, 38, who lives in Melbourne and runs a boutique interior design studio. She picked up on speaker. I could hear a restaurant in the background, the clink of cutlery and the hum of polite conversation. She said, "Oh, Dad, that's awful," in a voice you'd use to commiserate with a colleague over a printer jam. She said she had a major client pitch on Monday morning and absolutely couldn't move it, but she would absolutely fly up midweek if things were still serious. She used the word absolutely 3 times in a single minute. People who genuinely intend to do something don't need to say it 3 times. My youngest, Bridget, 33, lives only an hour and a half from the hospital. She works in property marketing on the Gold Coast. She didn't pick up at all. She rang back 19 minutes later. I could hear waves and music in the background. She said she was at a friend's birthday weekend at Burleigh Heads, and the timing was awful. But Mum was strong. Mum had always been strong. And she'd come up first thing Monday morning, unless something changed. I sat there afterwards, with my phone face down on my knee, and I tried to find a single word to describe what I felt. And the closest I could get was hollow. Not angry. Not yet. Just emptied out. As if a tap, somewhere inside me, had been left running for hours. And only now had I noticed the floor. I rang my daughter-in-law, Camilla, last. She is 39, also a lawyer, married to my eldest son for 9 years. I had always thought, in the quiet way you think such things about a person, that she was the most composed of all of them. That if anyone could be trusted with hard news, it was her. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was crisp and warm at the same time, the way she'd been trained to sound on a phone. She told me Alistair had already messaged her. She said she would handle the family communications, organize flowers, and liaise with the hospital, so I wouldn't have to. Then she said, very gently, that there were some preliminary documents she could prepare on my behalf for the bank, just in case Rosalind's situation changed, so that things wouldn't get tangled up later. She suggested she could bring them up the following day. She said the words, preliminary documents, and in case her situation changed, with the same calm tone you'd use to offer someone a cup of tea, and a part of me that had spent 30 years reading load tolerances on steel beams went very, very still. I told her I'd think about it. I ended the call. My hands were not shaking. That was the strange part. They were perfectly still. The way they used to go in the seconds before I had to make a hard call about whether to keep men working under a structure or pull them out. That was when the notification came through on the iPad I'd grabbed off the kitchen bench on the way out. The yacht, the champagne, the oysters, family time, finally. I sat there in that fluorescent hallway, and I understood 3 things at once, the way you sometimes understand a whole bridge by looking at one cracked weld. The first thing was that none of my 3 children were coming. The second was that Camilla had already begun positioning herself before Rosalind's chart had even been finalized. The third, and the one that hurt the most, was that somewhere along the way, while Rosalind and I had been busy paying off mortgages and putting them through private schools and helping with house deposits and grandchildren's swimming lessons, our children had quietly stopped seeing us as parents and had started seeing us as a balance sheet. A young nurse came up to me at about 11:30 that night. His name was Daniel. Mid-20s, quiet voice. A slight Kiwi accent. He didn't promise me anything. He told me Rosalind was stable for the moment, that she was on a ventilator, that the next 24 hours would tell us a great deal, and that there was a small family room down the hall with a kettle and a cot bed if I wanted it. He said all of this looking straight at me, not past me. It was the first time that day a human being had made eye contact with me while saying something true. I thanked him, and I meant it. And I went and sat in that family room for 2 hours with a cup of tea I didn't drink, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, I made up my mind about what I was going to do at sunrise. I rang Jeffrey Holloway at 7 the next morning. Jeffrey had been my solicitor for 19 years. He'd done our wills, the property transfers when we sold the holiday house at Caloundra, the trust we'd set up for the grandchildren's education. I told him I needed to see him before he went into chambers. He cleared an hour at 8:30. I drove from the hospital to his office in Spring Hill, with the windows down and the morning still cool, and on the way I felt something settle into place that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Resolve. There is a difference, and at 67 years old, I'd finally learned it. Jeffrey took one look at my face when I walked in and asked if I wanted a cup of coffee or to start straight away. I said straight away. I told him I wanted to revoke the existing wills, both mine and Rosalind's enduring power of attorney that named Alistair as the substitute decision-maker, and the family trust arrangement that gave Camilla a contingent role as professional advisor. I wanted all three torn up. He looked at me for a long moment over the top of his glasses and asked me if something specific had happened. I told him about the phone calls. I told him about Camilla offering to prepare preliminary documents before my wife had even regained consciousness. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he asked me if I'd checked our joint accounts in the last 24 hours. I had not. He turned his monitor towards me and walked me through what he could see on the bank's solicitor portal, which we'd set up years ago for trust matters. There had been a transfer request lodged at 6:14 the previous evening, 2 hours after Rosalind collapsed. $48,000 from our joint cash management account into a holding account held in Alistair's name. The reason given was anticipated medical and family expenses. It had not yet cleared, because the bank's fraud algorithm had flagged it as unusual activity on a senior-held account, and it was sitting in a 48-hour review period. That was when I felt my hands shake for the first time. Not from fear. From the cold understanding that within 2 hours of his mother going into cardiac arrest, my eldest son had been at his keyboard. Jeffrey kept going. He told me there was something else. Camilla's firm had filed a notice of intended action 3 weeks earlier. A routine sort of letter that solicitors sometimes lodge to flag a potential matter regarding the appointment of a financial administrator over Rosalind's affairs in the event of incapacity. It had been filed as a precaution, the language said, 3 weeks earlier, before any of this had happened. Before Rosalind had so much as stubbed a toe. I sat in Jeffrey's office, and I let the pieces line up the way they should have lined up months ago if I'd been paying proper attention. Camilla had been over for Sunday lunches asking questions about our investment property at Sunshine Beach. Alistair had been helpful, too helpful, about getting me to update my online banking to a system we can all access in case of emergencies. Imogen had been sending me articles about aged care planning. Bridget had been suggesting we sell the Tu Wong house and move somewhere easier to manage. None of it on its own had meant anything. Together, viewed from the chair in Jeffrey's office at 8:30 in the morning while my wife lay on a ventilator 40 minutes away, it meant everything. I told Jeffrey I wanted the transfer canceled immediately, the joint account placed under a dual signatory hold that required both Rosalind's signature and mine, and I wanted Camilla's notice of intended action formally objected to. I told him I wanted the wills rewritten that afternoon. I wanted Alistair removed entirely as executor and as a beneficiary. I wanted Imogen and Bridget removed as contingent beneficiaries. I wanted Camilla named explicitly in the documentation as a person against whom a conflict of interest existed and whose involvement in any future affairs of mine or Rosalind's was to be expressly excluded. Jeffrey asked me in a careful voice whether I'd thought through what this would mean for the family. I told him I'd thought about almost nothing else for the last 12 hours. I told him I'd spent 43 years as a husband and 41 years as a father, and the people who had shown me what I was actually worth in their lives had done so within the first 90 minutes of an emergency. I wasn't punishing them. I was finally believing them. He drew up the papers by lunchtime. I signed each one with a hand that did not shake. I drove back to the hospital. Daniel was on shift again. He told me Rosalind had stabilized through the night, and they were considering reducing her sedation in the next 48 hours to see how she responded. I sat in my chair by the glass, and I told her, very quietly, what I'd done that morning. I don't know if she heard me, but Rosalind has always been a woman who valued doing the right thing in the right order. And I believe somewhere underneath all that, she would have nodded. That afternoon, an email arrived from Camilla. The subject line was Urgent Family Welfare Concern. The body of it was a thing of cold, professional architecture. It accused me of acting impulsively under stress. It expressed concern about my decision-making capacity given my age and the recent shock. It suggested that the family was prepared to seek a medical assessment of cognitive function if I continued to make unilateral decisions affecting shared family interests. It was signed off by her firm's partnership block. Not by her as my daughter-in-law, by her firm. She was threatening to have me declared mentally unfit within 20 hours of my wife's heart attack, her own mother-in-law, because I dared to put a hold on a single bank transfer. I read the email twice. Then I forwarded it to Jeffrey, with one line of my own at the top. Please respond on my behalf with whatever language you think appropriate. I put the phone down. I looked through the glass at Rosalind, and for the first time since the day before, I felt something other than hollow. I felt something my old foreman used to call the engineer's calm, which is the particular stillness that settles on a man when he finally understands what he's standing on and what he isn't. Daniel came on shift again on the third evening. By then I'd been more or less living in that hospital, going home only to shower and feed the dog. I'd come to know the cleaners by name, and the registrar with the wedding ring, and the registrar without one, and the tea lady who slipped me extra biscuits without saying anything. Daniel had been the first person to be straight with me, and over those days he had become, in a very quiet way, the closest thing to family I had in that building. On the fourth day, Jeffrey rang me. He told me he'd received a response from Camilla's firm that had been, in his words, dialed back significantly once they'd seen the letter he'd sent on my behalf, which had referenced the timing of the bank transfer, the 3-week-old notice of intended action, and the Bar Association's professional conduct rules around solicitors acting in matters where they held a familial conflict of interest. He told me Camilla's firm had, in the most polite and bloodless legal language possible, indicated that she would be taking no further role in any matter touching on the affairs of myself or my wife. Jeffrey said, in his dry way, I don't expect you'll hear from her in a professional capacity again, Walter. Whether you hear from her as your daughter-in-law is a different question. I told Jeffrey I wanted to do one more thing. I wanted to formally appoint a medical decision-maker for Rosalind in case it became necessary. I told him I did not want it to be any of my children. I told him who I wanted it to be. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you sure?" I said I was. I said I needed someone with no financial stake in any outcome, someone who had spent the last 4 days actually present at her bedside, someone who had earned it. I said the world had taught me that the people who turn up are the people you trust. He drew up the papers. Daniel, when I asked him over a cup of tea in the family room, sat very still for a long time. He said he was honored but that he wasn't comfortable being a substitute decision-maker in a formal sense, given his role at the hospital. And he was right about that. But he said he had a cousin, a retired GP named Margaret, who lived in Indooroopilly, who would consider being named in that capacity if I met her first and was satisfied. I met her 2 days later in a small cafe near the hospital. She was 71, sharp, kind, a widow herself. By the end of an hour, I knew. I asked her. She said yes. The papers were signed that Friday. On the 7th day, my children turned up at the hospital. All 3 of them, together, with Camilla. They had clearly coordinated. I was sitting in my usual chair by the glass when the lift doors opened and they walked down the corridor as a little phalanx. Alistair was in front. Imogen was holding a bunch of supermarket flowers. Bridget had sunglasses pushed up on her head. Camilla was at the back, slightly apart, dressed for a meeting rather than a hospital. Alistair started first. He said the tone of Jeffrey's letter had been extremely upsetting for the family. He said I had clearly been under enormous strain, and that they were here, all of them, because they were worried about me. He said the words, "We love you, Dad," without looking at me when he said them. Imogen said she'd flown in that morning. She said it in a way that she clearly thought should count for something. Bridget said almost nothing. She kept glancing at Camilla, as if waiting for a cue. Camilla, when she finally spoke, used the language of mediation. She said the family was willing to set aside the misunderstandings of the last week and proposed a meeting in a neutral environment with everyone's solicitors present so we could find a way forward as a family. She said it the way she would have said it to a corporate client. I let her finish. Then I asked all four of them one question. I asked which of them had sat with Rosalind for more than 10 minutes in the 7 days she had been in this hospital, not visited the corridor, not stood outside the glass for a photograph, actually sat. None of them answered. Alistair tried to step around it. He said visiting hours and travel and work commitments. I let him talk himself out. Then I reached into my satchel and I took out a slim folder Jeffrey had prepared for me the day before, and I placed it on the small plastic table between us. I didn't hand it to anyone. I just put it down. Inside was a printout of the canceled bank transfer, a copy of the 3-week-old notice of intended action that Camilla's firm had filed, and a single page summarizing the new will, the new powers of attorney, and the appointment of Margaret as medical decision-maker. Camilla's eyes moved to the folder and then carefully back to my face, and I saw, for the first time since I'd known her, a flicker of genuine alarm. I told them that I was not going to argue. I told them this was not a negotiation. I told them that what they were looking at was the consequence of choices that they had already made, and that I had not made these decisions in haste but in clarity. I said that their mother was a person, not an asset, and that anyone who had treated her condition as an opportunity had no place near her recovery. Alistair began to raise his voice. I asked him very calmly where he had been when his mother went down on the kitchen floor. He didn't answer. Imogen began to cry. And I will admit that part was hard, because she was once a little girl I'd carried on my shoulders through the ferns at Springbrook National Park. But I'd learned late that tears are not the same as remorse. I asked her whether the client pitch on Monday had gone well. She didn't answer either. Bridget took her sunglasses off her head and held them in her lap. She said, "Dad, we didn't think it was going to be this serious." I said, "I know. That's the problem." Camilla tried. "One last time," she said, in a low voice. "Walter, you don't want to do this." I looked at her, and I said the only thing I had left to say to her. I said, "You stopped being family the moment you filed that notice 3 weeks ago." I asked the security officer at the end of the corridor, a kind man named Vincent whom I'd come to know, to please escort the 4 of them off the ward as they were disturbing other patients. There was no shouting. Vincent did it with great courtesy. Alistair looked at me as if he didn't know me. Camilla didn't look at me at all. Bridget was the only one who turned around at the lift, and for a fraction of a second I thought she was going to say something real. Then the doors closed. I went back to my chair. My hands were trembling, but only a little, and only for a minute. I sat there and I watched Rosalind through the glass, and I told her, quietly, that the worst of it was behind us now. Rosalind opened her eyes for the first time on the 9th day. She didn't speak. Her left side did not respond well. The neurologist sat me down in a small office and told me, in that careful, gentle way good doctors have, that the stroke had taken more than they'd hoped. Speech might come back partially, with months of therapy. Mobility would be limited. She would need significant care, probably for the rest of her life. He asked if I had support at home. I said I had what I needed. I moved Rosalind, after 3 weeks in the cardiac unit and the rehabilitation ward, to a small private facility in Indooroopilly that Margaret had recommended. I sold the Tuwong house, which had become too big and too full of stairs, and I bought a single-story place 10 minutes from the facility, with a garden that catches the morning sun. I go and see Rosalind every day. Some days she knows me clearly, and some days she watches me as if she's trying to remember a face from a long time ago. Both are all right. I read to her in the afternoons, mostly the gardening pages from the weekend papers, because she always loved her garden. Margaret comes by on Sundays. Daniel still drops in once a fortnight, off shift, and sits with her for half an hour. And she always squeezes his hand. My children have tried, over the months, to reach me. Alistair sent a long email about reconciliation and reflection. Imogen sent a card. Bridget rang twice and left messages. I have not replied to any of them. I am not punishing them. I simply have nothing left to say to people who showed me, in the clearest possible terms, what they thought I was worth. Some doors, once closed, stay closed, not out of bitterness but out of honesty. I used a portion of what Rosalind and I had built to set up a small fund through the hospital, in her name, to help families of stroke patients who can't afford the rehabilitation costs that Medicare doesn't cover. It isn't large. It doesn't need to be. Daniel sits on the small advisory board, and so does Margaret. We meet twice a year over a long lunch, and we talk about who needs what. And Rosalind, in her own quiet way, is in every one of those conversations. I'll tell you what I've learned, and I'll say it plain, because I think a lot of you out there listening, especially those of you my age, may need to hear it. The first thing is that the people who love you will show you in a crisis, and the people who don't love you will also show you. And you should believe both of them the first time. Don't make excuses for the second group. I made excuses for 30 years, and it cost me more than I can ever get back. The second thing is this. If you are over 60 and you have assets, no matter how modest, please take the time this month to sit down with a solicitor you trust, not one your children recommend, and put your affairs in proper order. Make sure your enduring power of attorney names someone who has no financial reason to want a particular outcome. Make sure your medical decision maker is someone who has actually spent time with you in the last year. Review who has access to your accounts. Don't share online banking logins with anyone, not even children. The most expensive mistake of my life was assuming that love and good intentions were the same thing. The third thing is harder. Family is not a status you inherit. It is a behavior you practice. Sharing a surname with someone does not entitle them to your peace of mind, your savings, or your decisions. The people who turn up for you when nothing is in it for them, those are your family, regardless of what's on the birth certificate. I lost 3 children in 11 days. I gained a retired GP, a young nurse, and a quiet sort of evening light I hadn't known in years. I'm 67. I look after a wife who can no longer say my name reliably. I tend a small garden, and I drink tea with a woman I trust on Sunday afternoons. I do not feel defeated. I feel, for the first time in a long time, that I am living in a house I built honestly, with people who chose to be in it. If you've stayed with me to the end of this, thank you. If anything in what I've shared made you think of someone, your husband, your wife, your own arrangements, please don't put it off. Make the call this week. And if this story moved you, please give it a like. Subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment, letting me know where you're listening from tonight. Take care of the people who take care of you. The rest will sort itself out, the way it always does, in the end.